Hello, everybody.
Hey.
Hello.
Hello.
How's everyone doing?
Not too bad. I was at Cloud Native Security Con last week, which I seem to have picked up a cold from. But as of now, I'm still testing negative on COVID. So I'm just like knocking on every wood surface in my house and testing every day.
So you're saying you caught a virus at SecurityCon?
Yep, that's exactly it. Almost too perfect, right? Suspicious.
I'm sorry, you have cold. It sounds like it's not too bad though, yeah?
It happens, right? Like, you know, if it was just a regular cold, that would be spectacular. You know, I think that maybe that's like one of the weird things that COVID has done to us as a people is like a regular ass cold is great news. So it's a good time to be a cold virus.
Yeah.
Should we get started? Looks like Julian is up first.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, we're figuring out the stream room muting stuff.
Hey.
Uh-oh. Every meeting we have some audio issues.
Sorry, we're having some technical snafus over here. Bear with us. Yeah, so Max, it's been a little while. Good to see everybody. Max told me that I think it's Anlan, who I've not met. Nice to meet you. Was pursuing, some kind of improved solution around offering a better referential data configuration experience for users. Something that we're interested in as well. And I just wanted to see what was up with that. Like, is there a doc or a discussion happening, and just see if we could help out. And yeah, that's all. That's all the context I had. So just wanted to check in.
And I guess, yeah, Max a couple of weeks ago sort of laid out the three main options that were being considered. And I think the key choice there was kind of, do we want to keep everything in the config, or do we want to basically create separate objects for each constraint that comes down, and each template? Max, correct me if I'm wrong. So that's I think the main design choice. And then on my side, I haven't worked on the proposal yet. We've had some other stuff come up on our side that was high priority, but I'd love to work together on that. Or yeah, that's about it.
Yeah, I think the next step is the proposal.
Yeah, so we're going analog with the changing of speakers for a second here. Yeah, I think the only thing I would add to that is there's a component of like order of operations that I was wondering about, where there could be an MVP where we generate these things statically, right? Just to get that generation code out there without needing to worry about the controllers. It's not necessarily a requirement, but it might be a faster time to delivery of something.
So when you say static, you mean that it would just create it once as opposed to like responding to changes? What would static mean?
I mean, add it to like the Gator command or something, right? Like Gator generate sync config or something like that, and keep it in alpha such that when we actually figure out do we have one resource or many resources, we could change that easy enough, but just give some users an easy thing to convert the annotations to actual configs.
Yeah, okay, well, yeah, with that stuff in mind, maybe we could, Anlan, if you wanted to pilot a doc and we could collaborate whatever at like whatever level of like solution works for you. If you see the path, like light it up. And if it's like, if you have a couple ideas, we could spitball whatever, whatever's good. But yeah, it's something that we're interested in pursuing as well. And yeah, I'm sure we can find a good solution to the problem.
Okay, that sounds good. I'll send a doc over your way.
Coolio.
Thank you.
Okay. I'm gonna mute mine now.
Yeah. Is anyone speaking? We just swapped speakers, so.
No.
Okay.
Anything else about this item? Are we good to go to the next one?
I'm good. I think Julian's good too. Yeah, he thumbs up.
Sounds like the next step is decided.
Yeah, do you guys know how you would be able to talk to each other, Anne and Julian? Or Anlan, sorry if I got your name
It's
wrong.
Anlan. It's
Anlan.
Anlan.
Sorry, but would you guys know how to get in touch with each other if you wanted to coordinate out of band?
Slack.
I guess no.
Yes.
So online there is a gatekeeper Slack. That's one way to do it. And I can send my email as well if that would work better for you. It's kind of up to you.
I'll
The Slack
get
is
on the
visible to
Slack.
everyone, so that might be nice. Yeah, I have a GitHub account as well.
Okay. Sounds
Okay.
good.
Yeah, I dropped the Slack invite link in our channel. I guess it's on the gatekeeper meeting notes already. So yeah, I'm good.
Good stuff.
Cool. Any other things we want to talk about? I see PubSub.
Yeah, so I wanted to like update folks on the conversation you and I had, Max, and the conclusion we reached. So on the Friday, we brainstormed on what should the interface look like, and ultimately the major conclusion we had is that we should maintain a list of clients per tool instead of one, so that we have the flexibility to talk to different endpoints using one tool with different client objects, and have more flexibility on routing requests. Based on that, and feel free to comment, Max, if I'm like missing out on any details. And based on that, I have updated the interface, and I have added a couple of diagrams as well that illustrates or visualize the interface. Hopefully that helps. Yes. So, and last we talked, last time we talked, I had two things to figure out. One is to improve upon the interface, which we did, and the other one was to look at configurability aspects for different PubSub tools. And on that part, essentially we discussed some part of it in the brainstorming session as well. Like we had two options. One is to consider config map to get the inputs from user. And the other one was to use a dynamic CRD, just like constraint template, to have the input from the user as well. And that part we were still not decided upon. So I wanted to discuss with a broader audience as well on what is pros and cons of both of them, and what would be best moving forward to take the configs from user.
Did we talk about the secret bit?
Yes, we did. But
Yeah,
secrets
like go ahead.
sorry.
Like,
so
go ahead.
we talked about getting secret, like sensitive information through secret, but other configuration options, how would we take input on? We did not talk about.
Yeah, so like basically, for any kind of connection to a PubSub, I would expect there to be some kind of secret, whether it's password or certificates or something like that, which is salient for the configuration thing. Like you could imagine loading the secret out of bands and have it be mounted, but that comes into complications, right? If you want to add a new PubSub queue, you probably need to restart the pod, and the loading path is a little weird there. You could just read secrets directly, and then does the config then point to the secret? Is the config just part of the secret? So there's nuance there. And then for a CRD versus just using a config map, traditionally the config map, you say, well, it's a little bit more flexible because you can put whatever you want in there. With CRDs, there's tricks to do the same kind of thing, right? You can create basically a schema-less CRD where you preserve unknown fields. You can do the key value trick. So I think the main difference between the two would be RBAC, right? Like, if you want to RBAC a config map, basically you got to do it like either all the config maps or config maps within a namespace, or RBAC them by name, right? Whereas if you have a CRD, you can more RBAC by category of config, right? Like you could give someone control over everything but PubSub, or vice versa. Which that would be a little harder to do with a straight config map.
I had a question about the auth. Does Dapper have anything built in?
It has configurations for MTLS and stuff like that, but for auth, I don't know what Dapper
I
has.
see this configure endpoint authorization with auth.
And MTLS is a type of auth, to be clear, right? Like, as long as you're verifying the client cert, or sorry, the signing cert, then it's and you're keeping your cert secret. It's a pretty good indicator that you are who you say you are.
We might want to use like the existing stuff instead of making our own to.
Right. Well, I think the question isn't so much how to create our own, right? It's more how to get the existing stuff into our system, right? Like maybe it's true for and I'm completely speculating here. I haven't read the docs on this, but for something, oh, what is the name of the pub sub thing? Anyway, for the pub sub library we're looking at, maybe it's that it reads the certificate from disk, right? And so we need a mounting point. And maybe we start with that. I would then argue that we have a usability problem, and maybe we want to figure out a live load path where we have a controller that copies a secret to disk to avoid the need to restart. But, you know, and then if we use something like Celery, I don't know if they have a Golang client, but some RabbitMQ client, it might have a different mechanism for authorization, right? And we need a way to plumb that through. So it's more about plumbing than inventing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. I think Dapper looks like it has its own CRDs for this.
Yeah, I don't know about the secret stuff, but Dapper, JDIP and I were looking, or JDIP showed me the Dapper configuration resources, and at least in terms of defining the kinds of endpoints that you could reach out to, both in terms of the like actual pub sub service and the channels or topics available on that service. That's configurable via resources on the cluster for sure.
A quick question, are we thinking that these pub sub solutions would be like a sidecar, or it would be its own deployment? Kind of like external data providers.
I don't think we need to take a stance on that.
I mean, it matters in the sense of like, kind of like how we dealt with external data, where you draw the line between like roles and responsibilities, right? Like for external data, we don't deal with external data providers off, right? Like you handle your own. We just handle the communication between the two. So same here.
Right. We do MTLS, right?
Right.
For our like off handshake stuff.
Right. So similar here, could we do something like that where, you know, to your point, like Dapper, RabbitMQ, they could do whatever they want, and they already have that already established, right? Where we just need to worry about how Gatekeeper talks to them.
Well, and I think this is what's unique about the driver model, is that we don't even need to worry about that piece, right? Like Dapper, for instance, has a very opinionated kind of thing where they say, we run a centralized service on the cluster, and you talk to us and we forward the request on, right? Mm-hmm. And so the constructor of the Dapper client is, as far as I saw, just like new client, done, no arguments. Whereas, you know, something like but what we're doing is we're wrapping that Dapper client in an interface, or at least that's the current plan. And users can write whatever they want to as long as it satisfies that interface. So if we start out with just integrating Dapper and leave it as an exercise to the user, if they're like, Dapper doesn't work for us, we want to use something different, they can write something that satisfies the pub sub driver that runs in process, or they could write a webhook. It's just how they choose to write their particular extension. If we tried to be more opinionated, I suppose we could. And the benefit there would be users wouldn't need to compile something. But in that same vein, people could just write a driver that is pluggable, that has that property, right? And you know, if other people want to run embedded, they can also do that.
I think the deployment model matters in the sense of like, will it require a restart, right?
Will it require, if someone wants to update, you're saying?
Yeah.
Well, and the driver thing, to be clear, because it's like a forking mechanism, at least that's how we started out thinking about it. Like it's worse than that, they would need to recompile if they wanted to add a new driver. Or, I mean, it's possible for us to include a few drivers out of the box to be sure. Kind of like the same thing we do with the metrics producers. But if there's custom ones, either they're forking them in, or we provide a interface out of the box that allows for webhooks.
So is the current proposal is that it would require recompile and restart, right? Like that's the current state, is that right?
I don't think that's inherent in the proposal. I think that is more of a work stream type thing. Like you could think of it like if the MVP is we just do Dapper and we have this interface and we let people do forks to do whatever, then yes, that's the reality. Either you're doing Dapper or you're forking and rebuilding and blah, blah, blah. But if people aren't happy with that reality and they're like, hey, we would like a webhook based sort of thing so I can do whatever, like run a sidecar, blah, 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 we could write that driver that allows for sidecars and it wouldn't affect any of the already written code. So it would literally be like a step 2. Or we could chunk it like it's sidecar as part of the MVP. And
Can we do it
wouldn't-
like a Helm only solution?
Was that?
Like Helm only solution?
Helm only.
So like sidecar comes with Helm if we specify it, but not with the regular deploy.
Oh, I see what you're saying. I mean, whatever, like regular, you could just inject the sidecar.
Yeah.
Or
But-
I mean, that will be up to users to figure out their own YAML. But with the Helm, we can do if Dapper enabled whatever, then we automatically add the sidecar.
Oh no, Dapper isn't. Dapper is not sidecar based, right? JDEP, there's like a central process running in the cluster. It's kind of like cert controller in that,
Yeah.
or cert manager.
Ah, I
sorry.
see. Okay.
For-
I thought there's also a path with the sidecar, so maybe I think I'm confusing those.
So what Dapper does is like that operator watches every deployment, I think, and the deployment that has appropriate annotations, it will automatically
I see. I
inject
remember that.
sidecars
Yeah,
in
sorry,
the
sorry
runtime.
about that. Sorry for the confusion. I remember that. Yeah. So it mutates and injects the
Yeah.
sidecars. I see.
Yeah.
So it's like a 2-stage thing. There's a sidecar for forwarding to the centralized service.
Right. I think I guess like the question comes to the operator then. Is the operator included with the regular gatekeeper deployment, or is it like a Helm chart thing only, or we just provide the instructions and then folks can install it?
What is the operator in this case?
The one that injects the sidecars.
Oh, well that's code that would be owned by Dapper, right?
Yeah. So we wouldn't add it to the gatekeeper.
Right.
But
Right.
would we want to install it part of like Helm chart?
I would still say no. Like, I think this is to be consistent with like Prometheus and Cert Manager and all these other projects. We want to have the Helm chart be flexible such that it's relatively easy for users to add this stuff, but we don't want to like embed a specific implementation in the Helm chart because then we're on the hook for supporting it, understanding it, and run the risk of like incompatibility due to version skew between like the latest Dapper and our config.
Yeah, I think I was more thinking like in Helm chart, like not embedding the YAML files, but providing as a dependency in the Helm chart. So we don't need to configure it, but just say dependency, and then it basically installs the default Helm chart. But I also get your point. Then we basically provide the documentation on like how to get started, and folks can deploy it on their own if they need the Dapper support.
Yeah, I'm not too familiar with the Helm dependency stuff. I don't know how flexible it is, but
Yeah, I don't know if you can do if else there. So I like the documentation based approach to start with. I had one question about the batching. Looks like it just got merged and it's going to be in the 110 release.
Yeah.
So, well, very timely.
I'm sorry, I lost the like path. We were talking about something initially, and then we jumped hoops to get
S- I
Like, we were
remember
talking about
reading.
the config map secrets versus custom resources, right?
Yeah.
Is everyone happy with their respective tangents, though? Rita, I think yours was the sidecar conversation, and there was also.
I just want to understand, like, how can someone add another pub sub, right? Like, what's the user experience here? If we're saying it would require a recompile or, you know, a restart anyway, then what's the harm in using secrets and config map?
Right. I see. And also, I don't think even with hard-coded stuff. So here's the difference. Like, so say we don't support in open source RabbitMQ out of the box, right? And I, as Google, like, say, really want to support RabbitMQ. So I take my fork of Gatekeeper and I put it in there, right? If I wanted to update how my RabbitMQ support worked, I would need to rebuild push everywhere. But I'm also free to design my, like, how RabbitMQ works with my fork however I want, right? So I could create a RabbitMQ queuing config controller or whatever, and every time someone creates a new resource, I create a new client to RabbitMQ, right? And they could reach out that way. So adding new instances of a client is not necessarily something that would require a restart. It could be if I decide that's fine and that's how I code it, but it also could not be. And then if open source, we want to support more than just Dapper, like we decide we want to support Redis Q or whatever natively, we can make that choice per driver, or we could just make a uniform kind of guidance of we don't ever want to require restart or whatever we decide is appropriate. And those would be like design principles for adding a new Q client.
Sounds like you're proposing or leaning more towards the custom resource.
I mean, personally, yes. I don't think anything I said immediately prior was necessarily requiring that. Like, you could do that with config maps and secrets. You could do that with mounts and restarts. I think more what I'm saying is they're decoupled.
I can see pros and cons on both sides.
For the CRD versus config map stuff. Yeah. I personally also don't have a dogmatic position. I just lean to CRD mainly for the RBAC benefit. But also I wouldn't put a secret in the CRD. So I could see like having just everything in the secret.
Although you can encrypt CRDs now, but that's beside the point. Yeah, I added that PR. But anyway, my concern there is just like, is it harder to maintain? Like, if we add another mechanism to create yet another like custom CRD?
Well, so I think, again, because this is forking, if we the core stuff that we support in open source, so Dapper seems like a for sure thing that we're aiming for. And let's pretend, I don't know, what do people like? RabbitMQ, Celery, we could literally pick any of them. But let's say we support 2 things out of the box. We can hard code whatever we want there. We could have a Dapper CRD, we could have Redis Q CRD, we could have a uniform config CRD. We could say just create a config map and tell us what using this value. Like, the world's our oyster. And then if someone wanted to fork and build their own thing, they could build on top of our work, or they could say, I don't like how that works, I'm just going to do something completely different, right? And because they're forking the code, that is possible, right? And the only thing our decisions might affect is how easy or hard that is to do.
Yeah, I was gonna say, it's like more work for the person who's like extending it.
Right.
But
Okay.
also just, another CRD, another API to maintain and to your point, right? Like, you're gonna need a secret anyway. So I don't know, maybe just to make life easier, we can start with secrets and config map and then revisit this at once we're like approaching beta, maybe. I don't know, just a thought.
Yeah, that's the beauty of alpha and also MVP.
Yeah.
It could be we have no custom resources to start with, right? Like, I think one config option was use command line flags, because we're just, for right now, doing what, audit events and webhook events, and treating it as like a global thing. We run the risk of needing to deprecate that flag in the future, but whatever, if it's an alpha.
Okay, so sounds like we are going to go ahead with config map and secret till we reach the alpha, and like we decide we want to change approach letterboards.
Yeah, I'm not sure if we gave you much hard guidance there. I think, yeah, you're free to kind of do whatever. I think the other theme I heard from that was we have this MVP that is more restrictive than our final use case, which is probably also per constraint directing violations to specific queues, right? And there's just a lot of groundwork that isn't there to support that right now, but we know we want to get there. So within that MVP, if there's a different decision than config maps that makes sense for you, for like just shipping something workable, and where you're okay with that sort of going away, if it turns out the more feature-rich thing in the future has different requirements, then also that's fine.
Okay, cool. And since we were talking about it, you mentioned that we want to eventually get to like a configuration that allows us to route messages per constraint template, or like more granular, right? So should that be a part of the design right now, or like should I think from a high level perspective that per endpoint I allow to use? Like right now, what I thought about the design is that like as of now, we will have the capability of using particular endpoints for the messages that are originating in particular part of the gatekeeper load. So for instance, if I want to route to endpoint 1 and endpoint 2 for the messages that are originates in the audit part of the code gatekeeper, the user will be able to do that. Then use endpoint 3 and endpoint 4 for validation part of messages of the gatekeeper. So that's still high level than per constraint template or like per constraint level. So all I'm asking is like, should we invest time in that right now, or should we invest time in letterboards?
Having the interface that wraps the client support that stuff, I think is worthwhile, because that's going to avoid when we're actually writing code that consumes that interface. And then we later write code that does the fancier thing. It reduces the risk we revamp that interface and then need to rewrite all that other code that we've worked on. Config loading, I think, is somewhat orthogonal to that, which is why I'm a little bit more hand wavy there. Then with regard to things that I think we definitely want to support. So I think we want to support the ability to have multiple different clients out of the gates, just because not everyone's going to be able to use Dapper, right? And so if they want to use this feature, but they can't use Dapper, having some at least way for them to do something about that seems good. Whether we need per any kind of like per enforcement point or per decision routing, I'm less sold on. Like because we are explicitly saying that doing it per constraint right now is off the table because there's groundwork that isn't there. Sort of our options would be send it to a different place if it's happening in audit versus if it's happening in the webhook, right? Is there a use case for that? Can anyone think of one, or?
Can you ask your question again?
Yeah, is there a use case for sending, if a violation occurs in audit, sending it to a different queue than if a violation occurs at admission webhook call time?
I mean, you can always extend it if somebody asks for it, but I don't think there's an initial one.
Yeah, and I think it also might complicate if we wanted to like up level in the future with sending per constraint stuff. There'd be more edge cases to consider. So I lean towards simpler to start.
Yeah,
too.
let's just keep it simple for starting. Yeah.
Okay, because I made this change because the last time we discussed, like you gave the example, right? Like maybe one message needs to be sent to sales department and then another message needs to be sent to like some other department. So based on our interaction there, I made this change, but like I can always go back to the simpler approach.
Yeah, that would be per constraint, right? There we're assuming that certain violations are more appropriate for like security and certain are more appropriate for, say, infrastructure, right? And so the different teams, probably the team that owns the policy is the one that's interested in the alerts. Okay. Not a guarantee, but probably.
Cool. Yeah, so that brings us, like that brings me to the last part of the discussion. I'm still a little dizzy about how we are delegating the auth work to the user, right? Like we are not responsible on configuring those things or worrying about those things as well. Like
when you say auth work, you mean authorizing the client with whatever messaging?
Yeah.
For this? I mean, mostly like we're delegating the protocol, the authentication protocol to the driver, right? So like Dapper has its own protocol, presumably, and Celery might have a different one, blah, blah, blah. The piping of the authentication data to the client, right? Like, how do I get my passwords to RabbitMQ client, or how do I get my certs to Dapper? That's probably a little bit on us, right? It might be driver dependent, right? I'm not sure how all these drivers are loading their credentials. The actual defining of the credentials and putting them into our funnel so that they can get into whatever client, that's on the user. Right? They need to come up with a password. They need to, let's say, put it in the secret that whatever driver is reading from, or whatever the design turns out to be.
Cool. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I think I have all the answers I was looking for right now.
Jacob, I have a question. I see like the RabbitMQ in the code. Is that just an example, like a placeholder?
Yeah, it's like, so I was testing around having at least two drivers defined so that it would be easier for me to define the interface.
Okay, but we're going to delete those ones.
Yeah.
So I was confused. Like, we don't need to implement the RabbitMQ one because Dapper one supports it.
So I wouldn't go that far because looking at the Dapper design, Dapper is going to be very hard to use from a platform provider perspective, I think, because it requires a centralized service be installed on the cluster, right? So either the users need to take their cluster and install this dependency, and then we can leverage it. And then you face questions of how do we configure that centralized dependency? Or the platform provider takes control over providing, installing that central dependency, in which case you deal with, okay, now you're providing another service to a cluster, right?
And when we say central dependency, is that the operator or the sidecar?
The Dapper, I guess they call it the operator, the core Dapper code that's always running on the cluster that does like sidecar injection and handles the routing of stuff to the final messaging queue endpoint.
Yeah, I guess that's another thing. With RabbitMQ, we don't have that requirement. Right. So it's basically cert manager, the same kinds of concerns, right? Like there's probably value in having a centralized service, and there's definitely, from my perspective, downsides. So I think we want to support it, but we don't want to be dependent on it. And so my question was more like just the implementation, like simplicity, because if you try to implement two different things, then it's just going to be like harder.
Well, JDIP's point was that he is doing that as a test of the interface.
Yeah,
right?
I think that's fine. I was just want to make sure that we would delete it, and then in the future we can open another PR for RabbitMQ.
Okay, yeah. So if you're trying to say that we would never want to support RabbitMQ,
no, I wasn't saying that. I was just saying like, hey, let's just start simpler with the Dapper one. We finish the interface and one example pops up model, and then tomorrow we open another one just to keep things simple so it doesn't get out of hand.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, I think I have enough understanding. So based on our discussion, I think these are the suitable actionable items. First is to get the part of routing different messages originating from different aspects of Gatekeeper out that I added last week, and then remove the RabbitMQ code if I'm satisfied with and ready for the PR to be reviewed, and then mark the PR to be reviewed so that folks can go ahead and review it. Yeah, I need to fix linting errors and other errors on it, but I think I'll resolve those errors as soon as I can, and then we'll mark it for ready.
Yeah, and if you want high level feedback, I don't mind if there's missing tests and linting or whatever errors. If you want directional feedback, because otherwise it's like just wasted effort if it's nice and clean, but it turns out like, but definitely like, let me know if you're looking for that, because otherwise I will just say, oh, it's in draft and move on.
If like I can mark it like ready right now if that helps folks to
Yeah,
start
or just
participating in.
me in a comment, like however you prefer to indicate.
Yeah, please like review if you can. Then I'll look at those comments and feedback and make the changes along the way. Don't like wait. I'll comment on the PR so that you guys get notification or reminder of it.
Okay, cool. Yeah, because I also don't want to review it if you're like, dude, like I'm still
Yeah.
working on it.
Yeah. I understand. Yeah. Yeah, cool, perfect. Nothing else from my side.
Any other topics?
Crickets.
Sounds like we're good. Cool. We can give 10 minutes back. Thanks, everyone.